Hello, welcome to Workplace Wake Up. I'm Jen Shaw. Every week, I spend about 15 minutes covering key legal developments, introducing you to interesting guests, and providing some entertainment to start your workday. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Oh my gosh, we're in April. How did this happen? I can't believe it. As HR people, Q1 is over. We have so many things to do and so many interesting developments. We're going to talk about compensation today because I'm finding that in many locations, California, but not only California, all over the place, there are these laws and rules about compensation and about posting ranges for salary. And one of the things that our clients are running into that I want to make sure I am alerting you all to is how you calculate compensation. And I want to make sure that you are not thinking of compensation as only being somebody's salary or hourly wage, okay? There are a lot of things that go into compensation: benefits, incentives, base pay, commissions, bonuses, 401k contributions, all kinds of things, all right? And when you're talking about needing to have compensation parity or compensation equity, where you are paying similarly situated employees for similar work, you cannot disregard these extra things you do for folks. So it may be a benefit like tuition reimbursement. It may be a car allowance. It may be some computer equipment that you give them to work remotely. Whatever it is, when you're trying to compare the compensation of different individuals in your organization, you have to be sure that you're comparing apples to apples. And you have to look at the total compensation package. What is the total package that we are dealing with? Okay. So one of the things I want you to start thinking about for Q2, this next quarter, right? If you're in HR, you're in employee relations. Now, if you're in a public sector workplace where the wages are all set, you might think you don't have to worry about compensation equity, but that's wrong. Because you have to think about what else are we giving these individuals? Yes, the pay may be based on a very specific structure, but the big picture is, what are we trying to compare? What are we going to be looking at when we're deciding whether we are being fair in our compensation? And it's everything we provide to the employee. So in Q2, I want you to start thinking about how you can do a compensation audit. How you can look back at what you are paying your folks, how you are paying them, how you determine how much you pay when somebody comes into the organization, how you determine what annual increases should be, how you determine bonuses and incentives and benefits. You have to have a methodology. So one of the things that is critical is for you to first understand, what is my universe? What am I looking at here? I don't know, for most of you, you probably have HRIS systems where you can run all this information in a report and you can get the total value of the compensation. A lot of folks call that TVC, total value comp. What's the total package that I'm giving to this individual? Maybe you have to do it on an Excel spreadsheet. Maybe you've never thought of it this way. So you've got to try to figure out, okay, how am I going to be able to, first of all, figure out what am I paying people? And not just, as I said, what am I paying them in terms of salary, but what am I paying them in terms of their total compensation value? That's what we need to be looking at. So the first thing you've got to do is you've got to get that data, okay? You've got to be able to understand where you're going to look and what you're going to be comparing across particular parts of the organization. So whether you call this a pay audit or a compensation audit, you need to do a systematic review of your compensation practices. And what the purpose of that, the goal, is to identify any discrepancies or inequalities in your pay. And remember, you're comparing apples to apples. So you're always going to be comparing similarly situated or comparable employees. So you're not going to be comparing what do we do for people in the C-suite compared to what do we do for people in the call center, okay? That's not going to be something that you're going to get any value out of because those are not similarly situated employees. But if you're not careful, you may be under-inclusive in the categories that you are looking at. So you do need to start thinking about what are all of the job positions in the organization and what tier are they in? What level? What am I comparing them to? Where is the equality in terms of the responsibility, the duties, etc.? Now, when you do a pay audit, as I said, you're looking to identify any of those disparities between similarly situated or among similarly situated employees. You've got to figure out that and make sure that you're complying with the law, right? And also that your practices, your comp practices generally are fair and consistent. Now, this is going to require you to review job titles and functions and departments and levels. You're going to have to look at employee data, things like gender and sex and race and other demographic factors. You've got to look at all of the TCV, right? The total compensation value, salaries, bonuses, benefits, any other forms of comp. And then you want to look at, okay, for the folks I'm paying by the hour, how many hours are they working? Are they getting overtime? Are there other factors that are affecting their pay? For example, do you have some sort of wage differential for working a particular schedule? And although it takes time to conduct one of these audits, you're going to get improved employee retention, improved employee morale. You're going to reduce your risk of potential litigation and legal claims for discrimination. And you're also going to be able to get up to speed on the newest compensation trends and best practices, okay? Because you always want to be looking at, well, what are your competitors doing? How are you going to be able to recruit and retain the best and the brightest? So there are really 5 steps to doing a compensation audit. You first have to collect and analyze the data on the compensation. And like I said, that may be an HRIS report. It may be a spreadsheet. You're going to compare the compensation among similarly situated employees. So for similar jobs and roles, you're going to identify any discrepancies or inequalities that you see with those similarly situated folks. You're going to figure out how to fix those disparities or inequalities, and then you're going to continue to regularly monitor and review your compensation practices to make sure that you're actually, that A, you've solved the problem, and B, that you haven't created any new problems, right? Now, one of the things for you to think about when we go through a compensation audit is making sure that you're involving the right people in the organization. So I've given you the 5 general steps of how to do this, but you also want to be thinking about what do I need to do in terms of communication with my internal folks? What do I need to do to make sure that I've got the right people involved? Now, one of the things to understand is that people sometimes need to know things and they sometimes want to know things. We're not focused on the people who want to know. We're focused on the people who need to know. All right? Not the people who want to know, the people who need to know. So when we talk about how we are going to bring people into this process, you want to be very picky about who you are involving. You don't need people who have their own personal agenda. You don't need people who just want to know what's going on, but don't need to be giving any input into what's going on. So you want to develop your team and your strategy before your audit ever gets off the ground. You have to do a lot of preparing. And this is true whether you do an HR audit, you do a wage hour audit, you do an I-9 audit, whatever kind of audit you're doing, you have to plan for it in advance. You have to think about, what are my goals? What's my purpose? What's my data? How am I going to figure this out? So you have to decide who you're going to involve. Then you have to set very clear deadlines, because what happens with this kind of project, and we've all been there, it's such a big project. If you don't give yourself a deadline, what you end up doing is putting it off and putting it off and putting it off, and it's not going to get done the way you want it to get done. And when you're doing an audit, when you gather that data has to be evaluated pretty quickly or it becomes stale. So it's not going to do you any good to gather a bunch of data and then wait 3 months to go figure out what's going on. So that is really important when you think about what your timing is. You want to actually put together a project plan, a schedule of, okay, when am I going to start? What are my key deadline points? When am I going to wrap this up? Now, you may have to flex the dates a little bit based on what's going on, but the problem is if you start without a deadline, you end up not having any real push to get it done the way you need to get it done. And as I said, if you wait too long, that data becomes stale and then it's not going to be helpful to you anyway. So you want to have deadlines. You want to make sure that you are also focused on what is my end result? What am I trying to do here? So if you're auditing for compensation, as we've been talking about, you're trying to identify any discrepancies or disparities, anything that's unfair, anything that you're trying to understand. So this is how it happens, right? Somebody gets hired and they're a really great candidate and we want them. We are short-staffed. We really want them. So they come in and we give them 10 grand more than we give somebody else in the same job. Well, we've got to be able to explain that. And it can't be explained by saying, well, they made more at their old job, because remember, you're not allowed to ask how much people were making. You're not supposed to make decisions based on what they made in a prior job, because that's how you end up building in discriminatory pay practices, right? So if I hired women at $20,000 less 30 years ago, but I give everybody the same raise, those women are still going to be behind the leaders, the males who are getting paid in that organization, because I started them out lower. They're never going to be able to catch up if I'm giving everybody the same percentage increase. So you have to think about, what is my goal? What am I really trying to do? And then this is critical for every kind of audit you do. You have to be prepared to fix it. It does you no good to do an audit where you find out there are problems, but you're not willing to fix the problems. That doesn't get you anywhere. You have to be willing to take a step back and say, okay, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? What's my plan? What's my strategy? How am I going to fix whatever disparities and discrepancies I find? And that's where you may need to bring in your legal counsel, right? Whether it's internal or external, you may have to have somebody who's able to walk you through the options, give you the pros and cons, and help you understand what you need to do as opposed to what you just might want to do, right? Like what's legally required. And then, as we talked about earlier, you've got to make sure that it stays in good form, right? So you have to do regular checks. You have to make sure that you are taking steps to drive compliance through everything you're doing in that area. The reason the compensation audits are trickier is because there are so many different things that are included in compensation. And it's really easy to talk yourself out of a disparity by saying, oh, well, they came from St. Louis, so they didn't need to be paid as much. Or, well, they weren't quite as pushy during the recruiting process and we were really desperate to get somebody, so we were willing to pay a little bit more. There has to be a legitimate reason to have a compensation differential. It could be geography. It could be years of experience. Those things are all fine. It could be different duties, obviously, but we're talking about similarly situated jobs, comparable jobs. Why might there be a legitimate difference in compensation for a position that is comparable? That is because there may be some baked in things that reflected or drove your compensation decisions, such as education, such as geography. When I was a new lawyer, I worked in the Sacramento office of a big law firm. We made a lot less than the San Francisco associates did, but we did the same work. And the funny thing is they were billing us out at the San Francisco rate. So it was very interesting. So we had to raise that issue, and eventually it they stopped having a pay differential because they realized, sure, geographically we were living in Sacramento, but we were working on the same work and we were billing out at the same rate. And it became not a legal issue. It became a morale issue. It became a retention issue. So that's the process for how you're going to go about a compensation audit. Okay. So it's Q2. Let's get this on the radar. You're going to want to get something by Q3 so that you can decide what changes you need to make potentially for Q4 and next year. Everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Go enjoy the sunshine. I hope it's bright and sunny where you are. It sure is in Sacramento. I'll see you next time. Workplace Wake Up, including our guests and hosts, do not provide legal advice in this podcast. Do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to spread the word, please share it with others. Post about it on social media and/or rate and review it. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, and email us at info@shawlawgroup.com.